After pressing and rolling your fabric, you are ready to begin to lay out, trace, and cut out your tote bag pieces. Before beginning, locate all your pattern pieces and determine which pieces need to be cut out of which fabrics. Unroll a section of the outer fabric onto the cutting table. The wrong side should be facing up. The total length of your outer fabric is longer than the example shown here. Use the edge of the cutting table to align the selvage edge of the fabric. Adjust the fabric as needed and pin the fabric to the table along the edges to hold the fabric in place. Check that the fabric is lying square. The grain of the fabric should be running parallel to the edge of the table, and the cross grain should be perpendicular to that edge. It helps to hold the fabric in place if the pins are placed at a slight angle, usually leaning in the direction of the edge. Pin down the entire section you're going to use. Check that it is flat on the table and that the grain is parallel to the edge and the cross grain is perpendicular to that. You are ready to begin laying out your pattern pieces. Begin with the largest pieces and work to the smallest piece. This is the bag body piece. For the outer fabric, you are using the flat lining as your pattern piece. Place the flat lining with the right side down against the wrong side of the fabric. The wrong side should be facing up with the stitch lines visible. The seam allowance has already been added to this piece, so there is no need to add additional seam allowance later. To conserve fabric, place the flat lining as close to the edges of the fabric as possible while keeping the grain line straight. Use the grain line on the pattern, in this case the horizontal stitch lines, to help you properly position the pattern. Using a ruler, measure from the stitch line to the selvage edge of the fabric at one end. Move the ruler to the other end of the line and measure. The distance between the line and the edge of the fabric should be the same. If it is not, adjust the pattern piece until it is. Begin to pin the flat lining in place. Double check that your measurement remains the same as you go. Pin the flat lining in place just to the fabric underneath. Do not pin into the table, as you will want to keep the two pieces together after cutting them out. Pin along all the edges of the flat lining. As you go, be sure that the flat lining remains flat and square to the fabric underneath of it. After pinning the flat lining in place, place the rest of your pattern pieces and trace them before cutting around the edges of the flat lining. All of the other pattern pieces for this project need to be placed, traced around, and have seam allowance added before cutting them out. I will show you this process using the inner pocket as an example. When cutting out a project, always start with the largest pattern pieces first. To conserve fabric, place the pattern pieces as close as possible to the edges of your fabric or the last piece laid out, but be sure to leave enough space to add the proper amount of seam allowance. Each pattern piece has a grain line, which should be placed parallel to the selvage edge of the fabric. To check that the grain line is correctly aligned, measure with a ruler from the grain line marked on the pattern to the selvage edge of the fabric. Measure from each end of the line. The measurements should be the same. If not, shift the pattern piece and recheck. To hold the pattern piece in place, push pins through the pattern piece and into the table. Double check that the grain line is straight by measuring in 2 or 3 spots along the grain line. Note that the cut edge of the fabric may not be cut along the grain line, so the fabric visible outside the pattern may not be even along that edge. Use the selvage edge to determine if the pattern is straight. Check that you have enough room to add the proper amount of seam allowance along each edge, and then pin the rest of the pattern piece flat against the table. After the pattern piece is pinned down, use a sharpened pencil to carefully trace around the outside edges. If your fabric is too dark for the pencil line to show up, use a tailor's chalk or dressmaking pencil that is in a color that will. Be sure to keep the pencil or chalk sharpened so that your line is thin and even. Carefully trace around the outside edges of the pattern. Use your hands to keep the edges of the pattern from buckling or shifting as you trace. Try to use light pressure to create a light line that will not be visible from the right side of the fabric. This is especially important when working with light colored or white fabrics. After tracing around the outer edges, carefully mark each notch. Make a small tick mark directly above each notch, beginning at the drawn line and going straight out about 3/8 of an inch. Next, check the pattern for any internal markings needed. The inner pocket has darts to mark. Carefully mark with dots at the point and sides of the line using the holes in the pattern. Next, add the seam allowance. Along each edge, there is a plus sign with a number written behind it. This is the amount of seam allowance that needs to be added to that edge. Use the see-through ruler to measure out the seam allowance. In this case, it is 1 inch. Draw a second line there. This will be the cut line. Add this cut line all the way around each edge that requires a seam allowance. If needed, remove pins that prevent you from resting the ruler flat against the fabric. Note that the inner pocket does not require additional seam allowance along the top edge. This is designated by the +0 located there. When you have finished adding the seam allowance, remove the pins and pattern piece. Use a ruler to connect the dots and draw in the lines of the darts. Use a longer ruler to connect the notches to create the fold lines along the top edge. Carefully place, trace around, and add seam allowance to the rest of the pattern pieces needed out of this fabric. Use the fabric scissors to cut out your pieces. Place your thumb through the small hole and the rest of your fingers through the larger hole. While you are cutting, allow the scissors to rest on the table. Be sure to cut only along the seam allowance line and not the stitch line.